This session here is really all about I guess, the intimate marriage between some core abilities of government and decision-making. And I think, and specifically we'll be talking about adaptability. And I think by now, most people have probably seen this cartoon. Hands up for people who have seen this already. Oh, so it's getting around, it's getting around. So we're talking about adaptability. And there are certain characteristics or traits that really help embed that into our decision-making, whether it be policy or business. And it's obviously important, as the cartoon would suggest. And perhaps even now, there's even a cartoon maybe off the screen now that would have a Toyota car on there in terms of quality assurance, quality control. So there's all sorts of things happening that's on the landscape these days. So I guess we are gathered here to talk about the intimate marriage, though, amongst three core abilities. And I just want to set this context before we get into the specific conversation about adaptability. But I think if we look at sort of the engines of decision-making and sort of some of the breakdowns that have occurred on making progress toward key issues, in many instances, they come down to three sort of core areas. I call them, for lack of a better word, calling them governabilities. That being sustainability, accountability, and adaptability. Very intimately weaved. And of course, we're going to spend most of the time on this idea of adaptability, but it's important to look at the intersection. I think we have this idea or notion of sustainability that is embodied by a certain number of principles. And here's a reflection of a few of the principles. The multi-generational aspect, the multi-dimensional aspect. We hear a lot about that in the previous discussion. The idea that sustainability is described by there's critical thresholds involved, both from environmental, social, and economic perspectives. And in fact, it's a very multi-stakeholder process, as we also learned. But there's also core principles for accountability that we see commonly if you're dealing in those spheres. And those talk about forward-looking elements, looking at issues in advance and anticipating. We have the need for an outcome and an evidence base to actually make progress toward accountability. Obviously, a link to the responsibility for performance and also transparency. So you see a lot of these words in discussions about accountability within an organization, be it a public sector or a private sector. Then we have this other third core ability, adaptability. And it brings with it some principles or characteristics, and we'll get into these. And a lot of them deal with anticipating. Can you anticipate what's around the bend? Can you actually help leverage the ability to self-organize, for groups to self-organize? Those people that are closest to the ground that see change coming, how can you take advantage of that for adaptability? And of course, the sort of traditional core of iterative improvement. We review and we monitor and we assess so that we can make course corrections along the way. So these principles, actually, when we take a look across the abilities, we sort of see that there's linkages, of course, and commonalities. We think about sustainability being a multi-generational issue and really across a number of dimensions. We see that accountability needs to be forward-looking, and we see that to be adaptive, you need to be able to anticipate. So for groups that are pursuing or have more of a mandate for any one of those, i.e. sort of sustainability, accountability, or adaptability, or risk management, there are intersections that bring these things together and, of course, tools that come along with them. So it's important to sort of see the intersections because it helps a conversation happen within an organization that brings people that are talking in silos. We can look at the idea of sustainability needing to be aware of critical thresholds and seeing that it's, in terms of accountability, asking for an outcome base, an outcome or an evidence base is critical, actually, for understanding critical thresholds. And for adaptability, if you're going to go through iterative improvement, we need an evidence base to help guide us. So these three are intimately linked to those principles. Finally, if we look at the last bit, if we have the idea, and we know that multi-stakeholder consultation and participation is core to sustainable development, we also know that transparency is very key for accountability. And that in terms of adaptability, self-organization we'll see as a very important trait. And all of these really deal with working with stakeholders as close to the ground as possible, because they're the ones that really can help us understand the issues. They are the ones that help us get legitimacy for pursuing issues, and they help us to create change. So I wanted to set that context before we sort of dove into the adaptability side, because there is a broader conversation here that is typically not had in terms of the intersection of these different abilities. And I think it's actually a good tool to have in sort of trying to advance conversations within your own organization. So that takes us to sort of the core of the focus. We're going to spend a lot of time talking about adaptability, but also we're going to see the linkages to the other abilities. We started thinking about this issue at the International Institute for Sustainable Development back about 8 years ago. And the impetus being that although we focus on core issues of sustainable development and substantive issues on sustainable development, we also understand that sustainable development is a really complex terrain. It's a really complex set of issues. So we need to also advance the way we make decisions, the way we develop policy, the way we make decisions, so we can handle these more complex environments. And so we took that on as something to do in addition to dealing with substantive issues like greenhouse gas emissions, water quality, and elements like that. We partnered about 4 years ago with the Energy and Resources Institute in India. That's an institute directed by Rajendra Pachari, who's the current chair of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And we worked with that group with funding from the International Development Research Center in Ottawa to actually really sit down and understand this idea of better policy making in complex and really uncertain environments. And the main thing that we're looking at, of course, is the realization that policies or decisions that cannot perform effectively in these complex, dynamic, and uncertain environments really sort of run the risk of not only not sort of accomplishing their purpose, but really getting in the way. And getting in the way of people to adapt to change. And that's, of course, quite a critical thing to not get in the way of. So a starting point that you'll see, and if you get a chance to thumb through the book, you'll see that it's anchored in some conceptual or theoretical understanding. And there's a really large literature out there on complex adaptive systems and complex adaptive systems thinking. And you'll see a complex adaptive system described as sort of different things. And one really good paper that was out there done by a gentleman by the name of Sholem Glauberman, who's currently at McGill University and also Baycrest Medical in Montreal. They wrote a paper that sort of tackled this. They describe a complex adaptive system as many individual self-organizing elements capable of responding to others and to their environment. Also, it's a network of relationships and interactions, and the whole is very much more than the sum of the parts. We've heard that a lot. Changes in any part of the system, even a really single sort of distant part of the system has reactions throughout the whole system. So these are all characteristics of a complex adaptive system. And it goes even further. The system just cannot be predicted with complete accuracy. It's just not possible to do that. It is always responding and adapting because there's people involved, there's ecosystems involved, and there's economic systems involved, and there's actors and elements that are constantly adapting. But there is this idea and the tendency for elements, actors within the system to self-organize, and that is a real leverage point, and we're going to come back to that quite a bit throughout. So there is a conceptual basis out there in a literature, and it's not just from someone emanating, and this Sholem Glauberman, by the way, is rooted in the health sector. That paper was about a toolbox for improving health in cities. But if you look across the literature, you're going to see a lot of examples where this type of systems thinking is used to help improve decision-making. Margaret Wheatley's work on leadership, Peter Senge's the fifth discipline on organizational learning, all rooted in sort of systems understanding. The information technology sector in the States really tackled this in terms of harnessing complex adaptive systems to better understand how the internet is going to proliferate and changes occur within that sector. Forest management. Healthcare, of course. Even the Mayo Clinic is really spending a lot of time on this. international development literature, and of course, people that are familiar with Buzz Holdings' work on adaptive management and adaptive assessment is really rooted in this understanding of adaptive systems and resilience. So there is a literature out there that helps us get an understanding of some leverage points. Now, the challenge, of course, that we set out to look at a number of years ago is that our experience with decisions, with policies, is that policies that are crafted to operate within a certain range of conditions typically fall outside of that range. And when that happens, things start to break down. So how can we introduce some new tools or amplify tools and approaches that are currently used in decision-making to help us better prepare policies for that type of a setting? The results of about 4 years of combing through a number and interviewing people impacted by policy in both Canada and India, and combing the literature as we just discussed, and doing a number of policy case studies to understand what has worked and what hasn't, we landed on what we feel are 7 guidelines or tools for creating adaptive policies. And this session is all about sort of penetrating each one of those tools and having a bit of a discussion to understand those a bit better and learnings from your own experiences. Because the key point here is that these are all experientially based. We saw policies that were working well in complex and very uncertain environments, and we looked for characteristics that help those policies work well. So these aren't things that we've just invented and we think will work. These are things that have been used in policy and have made them successful. And we're compiling them into a package that then can be sort of weaved together and sort of in a toolbox form. So you'll see here tools that help policies anticipate to what does lie ahead. So there's things we can anticipate by just being smarter and more due diligence in our work. And there are a number of tools we'll get into for that. But there's this other category of dealing with the unanticipated. There's always going to be the unknown unknowns. The famous Donald Rumsfeld quote, the unknown unknowns. They're always going to be there. Those are the surprises that we know exist. They talk about them in terms of black swans, as we heard in Hazel Henderson's presentation. They're out there. They're not just some things that may happen. If we're dealing with complex environments of people and ecosystems and economic systems, these things are going to happen. And are we handcuffed from the start, or are there things that we can do to help us work better in those environments? And we did observe a number of tools and guidelines that help out with that. So let's move into these one by one and have a sort of at least a sort of a shallow dive into each of these issues. And we will follow up, as you see in your agenda, how we're going to sort of sit down and discuss these a bit from your own sort of experience base. And then we'll come back and have a bit more of a discussion. The best way to penetrate this is to talk about it, and not for me to just list examples. So the starting point, though, is here. This is what we see. One of the things we did observe is that this idea of integrated and forward-looking analysis. Policies that really, and programs that started off by identifying the key factors that affect their performance, and actually try to look at scenarios of the future for how those key factors that affect the policy might evolve down the road. Those can be made more robust to sort of the range of anticipated conditions that can lie ahead. And here's where the role of indicators plays a very important part, in that these indicators, there are certain indicators that can help then provide signposts and then trigger important policy adjustments when they are necessary. So that's a very important sort of element that we did observe in a number of policies. And why is that actually important, to sort of have this integrated and forward-looking analytical component built into the policy process? How many people have heard of the parachuting cat situation from the World Health Organization? We have a few people in here. It's an interesting, real case study back several decades ago in Indonesia, when the World Health Organization was trying to eradicate malaria. So, of course, an program is to use DDT to eradicate the mosquitoes. Okay, it makes sense. This is going back several decades, of course. So the DDT was applied, and mosquitoes were eradicated. But so too so too did it eradicate the geckos that ate the wasps that ate wood. And when the wasp disappeared, the houses started falling down. But also, too, the cats ate the geckos, and the cats disappeared. And when the cats disappeared, rats proliferated, and disease proliferated because of that. And in the end, to correct the issue, the World Health Organization had to parachute in 14,000 cats into Indonesia to rebuild the cat population, to sort of deal with the disease that proliferated. So it starts off with a good program, with a good purpose, to eradicate a certain issue, but not sort of seeing the analytical and the connection and the connecting points to other elements was a hindering factor in sort of this particular program sort of achieving what it was trying to set out to do. So what we see is organizations using scenario planning techniques, actually, and in often cases rapid scenario planning techniques to lay the foundation for policies that can be adaptive. So of course we start off in policy design by understanding the issues, setting goals, ideally looking at performance indicators and targets. But the key point here is really getting at and looking at those key factors that affect the performance, looking at plausible futures and a number of integrating factors and how those could evolve, and testing your policy under those things. We're sort of calling those policy wind tunnels, as they're referred to in the book. Wind tunnels that can test your policy. And that's really embodied in the scenario planning approach that was pioneered by Royal Dutch Shell back several decades ago, and more organizations are starting to use it. So that's that particular tool, integrated and forward-looking analysis. And we'll see here that this card, this table here, has that particular tool to discuss in more detail after the presentation. The second bit, so we just talked about an analytical muscle that is very helpful for adaptive policies. But there's also a deliberative muscle that's important. And this is gaining multiple perspectives by engaging multiple people. So this idea of multi-stakeholder participation or collaboration is not just about getting enough people to sort of get support for the ideas that are being developed or to legitimize our decisions, but it's because getting multiple perspectives around a table is the only way to tackle a complex issue. There are no sort of single epistemic community that can really provide enough insight or smarts to really tackle these issues that are dealing with sustainable development. So it's really critical to have people around the table. Why is that important? Well, we can look at a program that was implemented also in Asia during the Green Revolution to introduce a new hybridized, high-yielding rice into Bali, an island in Indonesia. And that's a really good policy goal, to increase rice yield, because that was really important, because with expanding populations, that was really quite important. This program of introducing the high-yielding rice went in then and actually sort of introduced new management practices for how to allocate water for rice growing and how to manage water. What that program didn't do is it didn't go in and sort of really talk to the people that were already managing the water for literally 1,000 years in the region. And what happened was the high-yielding rice actually ended up sort of creating a really bad pest problem, which then ate the rice. And then in the end, rice yields did not even go up; they went down. What in fact was happening was the water temples situated throughout Indonesia and the water temple priests were the ones that were managing the allocation of water and saying who could use water when, and in the amounts. But the new system did not see that whole social and cultural element to water management. And in the end, the whole system broke down because the whole system of water management just was no longer in place. So deliberating amongst multiple stakeholders and seeing the different issues, you pick up on things that are outside of your original sort of sphere of I guess, objective. And you get to see and pick up on things that are socially and culturally critical to the implementation of a policy. So that's why that's important. And we see in the book, we talk about a number of examples within Canada, and abroad, where the sort of deliberative process has really been really quite helpful, and there's some guidance in there about how to sort of leverage and use that particular technique. We also saw this notion of built-in or automatic policy adjustment. And we saw that in a number of programs and policies that we observed. Some of the inherent, as it's stated here, some of the inherent variability in the socioeconomic and environmental conditions in a policy setting can be anticipated. So with some analytics, some integrated and forward-looking analysis, and some deliberation, we can start to identify some of these things and develop indicators and trigger important policy adjustments over time. There are examples of this. And there are different types of automatic adjustment that we have observed in some policies. And some are on the order of fully automatic, in that where a real good understanding of the issues that might arise is really well understood, and we can identify in advance the actual trigger and the actual policy change. And then that gets triggered at a certain time. But there's semi-automatic adjustments, because we don't always fully understand the issue. We may understand that if this situation materializes, the policy will likely need to change, but we don't quite know the nature of the exact change, so we might have to get back together again to decide that. And that's a bit more of a semi-automatic or semi-built-in. These all require signposts and triggers, and indicators and measures play a really important role to providing the guidance for these types of adjustments. So we're seeing, as we move through these, the role of indicators and measures in this whole adaptive process, which I think is quite intuitive. Now, the fourth tool guideline that was quite common, and this one perhaps spoke the most loudly when we were looking at the ability to deal with the unknown unknowns, the surprises. This idea of enabling the self-organization, the self-organizing potential of local actors, and for sort of enabling the social networking of local actors is really critical. So it's not only, basically the first thing is not to undermine existing social capital, but also create these forums where social networking can happen, facilitate the sharing of good practices, removing barriers to self-organization. These are all important to dealing with these unanticipated events. And this is a really important one. This gets beyond sort of our traditional sort of understanding of tools for policy making and policy implementation. And getting into more of the contemporary side of things. And why is it important? Well, of course, just the example where we went in and we got in the way of the existing social capital of the water temples actually interacting to manage the distribution of water for rice growing. So that sort of layer of social capital it wasn't about enabling that, it just was completely undermined. And it was completely devastating to this particular program. And there are numerous examples of that, and I'm sure many people can sort of relate to those types of things. 5 minutes, okay, we're getting there. Ottawa's own policy research initiative, sort of a horizontal agency within government that helps sort of unpack some of these issues for departments across government. It came up with this figure a number of years back. And we can see how at the top of the pyramid, for really sort of making use of social capital and policy making, it's about building and supporting networks, tapping into existing networks. So, of course, if we talk about the Baldy example, we're seeing how these are really important, the water temples, for example. Establishing favorable conditions for network formation and at least increasing the sensitivity of our programs and policies to the existing social capital that's out there. So I think there's a lot of work to be done in understanding social capital and existing networks when we're going about policy making, and I'm sure that work will continue, and there needs to be even more emphasis on it. So the book gets into that in terms of examples where we do see this. We saw this, I guess, in Hurricane Katrina down in New Orleans, where self-organizing groups were the ones that were really providing a lot of the support for recovery there. We saw it in China during the earthquake, and I'm sure stories are going to emerge also, too, over the latest two unfortunate incidents of earthquakes. So these are important tools, and perhaps one of the loudest ones. Now, similar but different is this idea of decentralization of decision-making. And, of course, this is where people on the ground are a little bit more sensitive to the issues that are important, and they're more sensitive to the change that occurs. So this is not a carte blanche for just decentralizing all decision-making. Where there is an accountable unit of governance, or where an accountable unit of governance could be created, decision-making closer to the ground really does help deal with unforeseen issues in a much better way, because it increases the capacity for reform, policy reform, when confronted with these unforeseen issues. And we do see examples of that, where the decisions are made on the ground. Examples in Manitoba, we have the Manitoba Conservation Districts, which are sort of a decentralized planning and decision unit within the Manitoba government. And in many cases, decisions about, for example, land drainage are made in the field, on the hood of a truck, with some of the key decision makers and stakeholders there, and decisions are made there. And in fact, in incidences where that has happened in Manitoba, those conservation districts have been the most effective on handling drainage issues and other land management issues. So there are many examples on the ground. We're going to move on again to another tool for dealing with the unforeseen issues. And this is this whole idea of promoting variation. And this gets into ideas even of redundancy that you hear in risk management. So given the complexity of pretty much most policy settings, implementing a variety of policy approaches to address the same issue does increase the likelihood of achieving desired outcomes. And as I noted, sort of diversity is a really common risk management approach. And it is really critical for this whole unforeseen, dealing with the unknown unknowns. We did observe, in looking at a number of examples in India and Canada, that there are sort of different roles that the policymaker can play in actually trying to make this sort of thing happen within program and policies. The policymaker can be an architect, and that sort of by providing a range of policy options, by using a mix of instruments to achieve a single objective, by seeing linkages with other policies that are out there that are accomplishing similar objectives, by making the connections. But the policymaker is also more of a facilitator to make this happen. So that is creating the enabling environment for variation to occur, and that has a lot to do with really enabling that self-organizing element for helping local people to get together around the issue, and because that's where a lot of the innovation does occur, and then we see that on the ground. There's also policymaker as the learner. So it's when we do have a mix of policies in play, observing and monitoring which ones are working, because in complex adaptive systems, the system will actually select which policies work. It's not going to be the other way around, where policymakers select the one that works. The system will tell you which one works. So the more approaches we try, the more likelihood we have for success, and we can strengthen ones that work and drop ones that don't work. So again, performance and monitoring plays a critical role here in this one. And finally, the last tool, the one that we're perhaps most familiar with, is this idea of formal policy review and continuous improvement or learning. So, but this is really talking about regular systematic review, even when the policy is working well. And the use of pilots or experimentation of policies to learn what works and to adjust is really critical to really addressing emerging issues and dealing. This helps with unforeseen issues and better anticipation, because it keeps policies and programs linked to what is working and what is not. I think we've, of course there are examples out there. This is a slightly legible cartoon from the 20s, I believe it is, of our Canada's famous crow rate policy that survived for better part of a whole century. So back in, I think it was about 1897, I think the crow rate was enshrined in legislation as a rate subsidy for transporting grain from the prairies to ports of export. And it was a freight rate that was locked into legislation in the late 1800s, about 1897. And it remained in legislation for the better part of the early part of through about 1940s. And really locked in until about 1980, actually, until the Western Grain Transportation Act actually overhauled it completely. So during the period it was locked into place, this thing called inflation emerged in the economy that no one really had a really good sense for. And that inflation resulted in handcuffing both sort of the railway and the farmers, and the whole rail system just pretty much just deteriorated, and we lost our ability to really export to China and Russia when it really mattered. And it came to stark relief. So when that happened, all of a sudden a series of about 6 commissions were formed to investigate, well, what's happening? Why is it happening? Do we need to change? And that was over a period of about 20, 30 years where these commissions were just one after the other. So it was ad hoc review, ad hoc policy review, which is important. We will always have ad hoc review, which is just sort of stimulated by sort of a number of complaints that converge into some action. But what we're talking about here in this tool is systematic policy review that happens on a regular basis. Every year, every 2 years, even when the policy is just working perfectly fine. You get people together, you use some integrated and forward-looking analysis to peer ahead, and you can start to pick up on these emerging issues that are hovering and on the radar screen. And you can make adjustments or put adjustments on the shelf that could be leveraged in a little bit later time. So really, really quite important. That, I just sort of close to being on time for just a sort of me talking portion here in terms of doing a very shallow dive on the 7 guidelines or tools for creating adaptive policies. And so I think maybe we'll pause here for a bit of just sort of questions of clarification.
Darren, the book and the tools are really quite exceptional. I want to congratulate you on the work.
Thank you.
But I've got a question. As you know, my frame of reference is working within the federal system. And large bureaucracies are characterized by one quality in particular, and that's inertia. You know, I tend to refer to the federal government as a bit of a gestalt. It's a couple 100,000 two-legged cells running madly in one direction. Trying to get them to shift one way or the other requires either considerable activity externally or considerable activity internally. And I'm wondering if the next book is going to be about what needs to be put in place to start moving systems of governance from traditional models where we've got, right now within the current circumstances, very top-heavy controls, very limited accountabilities, and how we move rigid systems of governance towards these models, because you know, I've been pushing a lot of these approaches for 20 years, and you have more or less success. When it comes down to democratic systems, you've got political accountability, but often advice, analysis, recommendations that are coming up from the bureaucracy. You have very little control. It's informed by the values of the decision makers and not necessarily the policy makers. So just when can we count on the next book? Have you thought about it?
Well, your comment is sort of right on mark in terms of, in the current book, we do try to lay out what we observed working and give each chapter sort of practical ways of how is this tool implemented, how does it connect to other tools, and those being experientially based from what we've observed are things that have been working, and presumably being from India and Canada, there is that sort of inherent backdrop of the inertia, the big ship trying to change. So there are examples where these individual tools have worked, so there is a bit of guidance in there, but the thing that we need to penetrate next is stockpiling the key barriers to the implementation of each of these. And you'll see this question embedded actually in the sort of the group discussions we'll have after this. And those stockpiling of that is now in the works. We do fortunately have some ongoing funding from International Development Research Center to continue thinking about this. And we are trying to base this on some action learning, sort of working more with government policymakers on trying to implement these package of tools on new policies, and then following that over time to really see how they bumped into these key barriers and how they broke them down. So hopefully the next book will be more of an action learning sort of based, from current experiences about the package of tools. Because there's very few examples of the whole thing coming together. Individual tools are being used, but to bring them together is a challenging thing, as you identified, so thanks for that. This is a good example here of the crow rate, this sort of the ship, and how policymaking, I think there was an American poet that described policy and lawmaking as like sausage making. It's best not to see them being made. And here, the freight rate grinder, here, the freight rate separator, they call it. Here are all the policy inputs. This is going to help things out, the farmer. And then down here, the farmer gets the farmer share down here, and then the freight railways get a bigger share. So the whole policy process was messy, and it didn't all work. So a key understanding of this whole thing is that policy is not some nice little linear diagram or a circle. Even though we present a circular, idealized policy-making process, we follow that right up with, okay, it's like sausage making. So there's no real neat way to tuck these tools into different places. It's a very messy thing and well acknowledged.
Just a short question. I think you answered my question. In this, when you refer to tool in these questions that you've assigned to us, you mean each of the 7? You don't mean the package?
Yeah, individually, sorry, yeah. So you'll discuss as a
you
group
mean by
that
tool.
particular one. But we'll have plenary, so if your interests lie in other areas, you'll have a chance to sort of share an experience. Yeah.
Thanks. I too come from the federal government, so I think I want to pick on the province for a moment instead, because it's too easy where I am. I guess I want to ask a question about rewarding the failure to adapt. And I'm just thinking, a lot of us have lived through recently this question about bailing out the auto industry. You've seen that done in Ontario. And you see people talk about that in the States, and the great concern by the right generally in the States about the bailing out the financial services sector and others. And I guess so long as I think that the public, we think that we'll live through these boom-bust cycles and there'll be public bailouts at the end, I think it undermines the interest in taking a more resilient or an adaptive approach. And that's probably engendered by the power, a sort of monolithic of the current sort of industrial makeup, which then leads me to wonder about how do we better hear the voices of those new and emerging types of technologies or other things that that don't receive they don't receive a bailout because we want to see them not you know what I'm getting at, disproportionately disadvantaged by supporting an existing system that we think should change over time. So it's I think we need to better hear the voices of those without a lot of power in the moment. And how do we do that?
That's an excellent point. And I think it's in the Chapter 9 where we talk about the formal policy review and improvement, where we talk about these different modes for triggering a review. And one is time, of course. Every year, every 2 years, there should be some time trigger. Even so that when things are working good, still a review is triggered. But you'll see there's a number of triggers listed, and one of them is actually this sort of new information, or even complaints. And it's sort of, there's a bit of a call in there for ensuring that we have the capacity within sort of departments to take in sort of this feedback from the people that have less power. And often these are sort of received as, another complaint. But when they're stockpiled, there's a symphony within the sort of individual chorus lines that can be picked up if there's enough capacity to digest the information that's coming in and the new. So this is not only to individual stakeholder information, but this is also, I guess, when new information comes in from academia. How can that sort of then inform the policy process? So our idea of this formal policy review is to sort of really engender that type of information. And can that trigger policy change or trigger a potential policy change that could be put on the shelf? So I think that's very important, and we touch on that a bit, but probably not give it any due justice, as you mentioned.
Yes, hi, Darren. It's Hans. I guess I can't resist to say something about measurement, because a good deal of my life was dedicated to measuring, partly at Statistics Canada and the Economic Council. And it's not as much, I think we do a great job of measuring, of measuring statistics that we really base our policies on. I think the scarier part is that we get into the domain of forecasting, of where things are going. And I've seen in the past, and it's not only with the environment, but that a lot of wrong policy decisions are made by miscalculations out of forecasts because there's so many unpredictable elements. So I'll just leave it at that because I know we're running out of time.
Yeah. No, it's a very good point, and we did spend a lot of time on sort of the chapter on integrated and forward-looking analysis. And I think to address that very sort of quickly and insufficiently, sort of thinking more from forecasting to foresight, I guess, in sort of using scenario planning processes to sort of articulate some more, I guess, fuzzy hypothetical futures that might emerge, testing how things might respond in those worlds, and then sort of thinking about potential policy adjustments, some that are robust that can be implemented now, and some that can be maybe put on the shelf and triggered later. So policy wind tunnels that look at a number of parameters and not necessarily just sort of forecasting to specific areas or making single forecasts, I think, is important. But of course, within foresight, you need to forecast individually too. So there is a line that needs to be walked and sort of paid attention to, as you noted.
Just wanted to raise the issue of vision that all of these policies are ultimately oriented towards, because it seems that many times policies are developed within narrow parameters and don't ultimately test themselves against the larger image of a sustainable world or a sustainable society. And because we haven't formulated a vision of what that is with 6.5 billion people on the planet, or even at the level of Canadian population, it seems like a huge missing piece and a very difficult thing for any policymaker to come up with these kinds of policies if there isn't a vision at the larger level.
Of sustainable development.
Right.
Yes, I think what you said there is when you're doing integrated and forward-looking analysis, what is that lens that allows you to see outside the scope of your particular objective or project? So what are some of the social, economic, environmental issues that will allow you to see some of these unintended effects when you've really got sort of the focused glasses on? And there are tools out there that help to see these different things when you're in the policy design process that are based a bit more on principles of sustainable development. I think about an example of which would be like the 7 questions to sustainability that the mining sector developed through the mine and sustainable development process back about 7-8 years ago. There are examples of multi-perspective analysis where policymakers are given a little bit of a lens to look through to sort of see if their policy is going to hit on some of these issues that aren't directly related to their mandate. So there are examples where these little tools are being created to help the policymaker, but we're not quite there in the systematic use of those within government and business, so we've got a long ways to go.
I was thinking about the speaker this morning, and Hazel Henderson, and her vision of an economy that is going to be sustainable. Some of those are just, they fly in the face of the whole economic structure, and everybody else seems to be working with a fairly traditional notion of an economy. So how do you begin to really align these things?
Those questions, they can start as sort of simple questions that are put in the hip pocket of the policymaker and then eventually maybe become more generalized accepted principles. But yeah, I agree 100% on the need for that. But I want you to spend 15 minutes talking amongst yourselves in terms of a particular set of questions. These are all experientially based. So when we do interact in groups like this, everyone sort of has some experience where some of these tools have been used in various ways. So I would like you to spend a bit of time in answering, have you seen this particular tool, integrated and forward-looking analysis, applied in decision-making in a business or in a government? And how did it help that program or policy become more adaptive? Stockpile that, and if you could write them down, there's a notepad on each table. I would please ask you to write your example down in just enough information so that we perhaps could track it down, because we do want to stockpile these examples over time. So please do take a notepad and a pen and write down your examples. Also, too, take a bit of time to discuss what do you perceive as the main barriers in the use of that tool. So this is getting to what Greg had brought up. I mean, there are huge barriers to the use of these various tools. And it's important that we start stockpiling them so that we can understand how they can be broken down over time as to allow the organizational change to happen for some of these tools. And then also talk about this in terms of, well, how does this particular tool that you have on your table address accountability, and does measurement play a role in it? So think a bit about that. And we're going to come back in plenary and deal with the first question and then the second and third one in two different chunks of time. And so as just a bit of incentive, so we have some good conversation, that sort of the examples that we do ask for, if you're able to get up and you're very excited about presenting your example, please do so as an individual, and then you could take home a copy of the book. I'm assuming that that's good incentive, of course. And I appreciate very much the conversations that you're all having at each table, and because this is, without a doubt, this is a two-way information flow. As I mentioned, this is an ongoing sort of ongoing set of discussions that we're having at the Institute and outside of the Institute. So information that we do compile here is going to feed into sort of the improvement and how we discuss and present this information as early as the next time we do this. So your information here is really much appreciated. So I thank you in advance for the discussions that you're having. Let's spend a bit of time on this question right here in terms of, have you seen this tool applied? And we'll have someone raising their hand already. And I'm just going to open it up to volunteers and just rewards for providing a good example. Just take a copy of the book that's at your desk.
Yeah, our table has the multi-stakeholder deliberation as our tool, and we all agreed it's a slam dunk. It's one of those tools that everybody talks about and you have to have. I work with the Canadian Index of Well-Being, and from the beginning, and now too, we are committed to multi-stakeholder deliberation, and we've had several different ways of doing that. We've had focus groups all across the country at 2 periods of time. We have a large working group of about 36 people. The upside of it is that you do get a lot of information. And in our case, the focus was on quality of life or the well-being of Canadians. And what we discovered, as you would imagine, is that a lot of different people have different ideas about what the constituents and the determinants are of well-being or quality of life. So it was good. The more people we had around the table, the more sensitive we were to what everybody was doing. The downside was we couldn't get that group focused and going in any one direction. Meanwhile, we had funding limitations. We had a wonderful supporter who is still our best supporter now, the Atkinson Charitable Foundation, but they live in the real world. They needed product, and they still need a product. So the downside was that somewhere along the way, we were going to have to slow down on the multi-stakeholder collaboration and get us going in one direction. And that was a downside, and those of us who were in the steering committee for this thing feel the pain of having to go forward on our own, more or less. And so we always have one eye on the bigger group. But to answer the third question, of course, you still need multi-stakeholder deliberation for accountability. And we use the term for validation, because in our case, we feel that if the Canadian Index, if Canadians don't hear their own voices and see their own faces in that index, we will have failed, colossally failed. And so we need it for validation, not just for accountability. That's my story.
No, thanks. And you bring out, you parsed it into 2 pieces that are really critical for this conversation. Because the first part is about, you say, your focus groups. And you're going there to explore, to get sort of ideas. Well, what makes up these different constituents of well-being? What are people thinking that makes that up? So you were really using it in a deliberative sense, because you were trying to explore and discover something that you did not already have on paper. And that's a critical part of this, the deliberation point, is that we need the perspectives around the table to really even penetrate the issue. So you weren't trying to, at the first stage, you weren't trying to get validation or legitimacy on something you've already done. You were trying to create it. But then you note in the second part of your discussion about how important it is to actually use the process for validation and to be accountable to the people. So there are different ways that the deliberation is used in the consultation. I think it's important to think about those two, because a lot of times we go into multi-stakeholder processes with just the legitimacy or the validation part of it, and that doesn't necessarily help you with penetrating complex adaptive issues. So thank you for highlighting that and for making that distinction.
We're not here to get validation. We're really here to get your ideas on the complexity, the scope of this thing, because it's so ingrained that stakeholder process is about getting support.
It becomes quite evident, and any stakeholder is pretty savvy to know when they're there to validate and when they're there to actually generate. Right. So if you go and then your first slide is your actual solution, and you ask, does this look good? Then they're sort of knowing they're not really part of a deliberation. And people pick up on that. Stakeholders are extremely smart, and they'll know when they're really being asked to solve a problem as opposed to validate a solution that's already been created.
And so you're saying there's not a problem in laying that out up front and being...
No, not at all. And sometimes you do have a solution. I mean, if you do have a very restricted sort of amount of funding and time, you'd be completely upfront as, well, we've got this initial thing that we think is a good starting point, and then sort of, but if it's clear that you don't have the capacity to actually change as a result of the conversation, then boy, that'll burn the bridges really quickly. Right. But you highlighted the constraints and the barriers in terms of funding and time. But it sounds like you did penetrate into a process of focus groups, and I, in fact, was even a part of some focus groups that were held in Winnipeg and to penetrate some of the issues. So you did that to an extent until you hit the barriers, and then you had to sort of rein it in, and I think that's part of the whole messy process of multi-stakeholder sort of engagement. So thanks for that. All right, that was a very good sort of penetration of that particular tool. Any other volunteers of great examples that from experience?
We discussed water quality, and with promoting, our tool is promoting variation, as in multiple policies to address particular issues. And we discussed water quality, which is governed in Canada by multiple jurisdictions and policies and legislation at the local, municipal, regional levels, provincial, territorial, and federal, Fisheries Act, SEPA, provincial, territorial mandates, and so on. And while it works well in terms of overall perhaps giving us good water quality, there are instances when these different acts and policies actually contradict one another and make moving forward an issue. Brian gave a good idea in terms of the context that variation is constrained by mandate, so you get your silo effect, and you don't get a crosstalk between them, so that everybody recognizes that they're all working towards the same final outcome. And unfortunately, it's increasingly with complex systems, it's difficult to find somebody that can actually take a look and oversee the issue and understand all the different factors that are influencing what it is, the particular issue you're dealing with. An approach to dealing with that could be by, committee sort of thing, but then you run into the problem of accountability again, where you've got multiple people accountable and then nobody really is, and so on. So variation in policy is a good approach, but it does have its challenges.
Very good, thank you. When I was hearing you sort of highlighting some of the different roles that were put up on the screen too, because you talked a bit about sort of a suite of policies being put toward an issue, and then some of them being contradictory. So the policymaker as an architect plays an important function, because you're trying to see the synergies with other policies, but in that same process you see the what do you call them, anti-synergies, that are hard to pick up on, and there's tools, I guess, that can be used to, like action impact matrices to see some of these cross impacts. So that's perhaps an important function then that you highlight for promoting variation, is that sort of architect role or that project manager role to see what these suite of policies are doing. So that was very, thanks for that.
We also need to enable you to address the gaps or the barriers or the issues that are conflicting within your sphere.
Okay. Now, just a question back to you then on the water quality sort of issue then, if it's probably sort of more of a messy process of a number of instruments being applied toward, as opposed to a conscious, okay, here's the issue, let's make sure we have a suite of economic instruments, regulatory instruments, and that type of thing. Yeah. Is there any sense for a formal review mechanism that takes a look at the suite of instruments that are trying to tackle water quality in either a general or a place-based setting, and trying to figure out which ones are working in terms of types of instruments even? Yeah, or is it still a messy process where that review oversight of what's working and what's not? The policymaker as learner function, I guess, is maybe what I'm trying to uncover.
Actually, when I look at the concept of promoting variation through multiple policies, I look at it also from the other perspective. The other side of that coin is to have one policy, but it be flexible so that, yes, in fact, it is place-based when you're implementing it. Comprehensive community planning was the example I used. Integrated community sustainability plans, which are mandated across Canada now, to be brought in, is another approach as well. So that's kind of the opposite perspective of multiple policies. You've got one policy, but it's implemented in a local, regional area, and in whatever way is appropriate for that particular place, space, that sort of thing.
Yeah, thank you. Greg, I saw you sort of had almost a hand up, or you wanted to add anything there? Or?
I was just going to say that in terms of promoting variation, if you're going to use variation as an approach and you're dealing with different levels of accountability, different jurisdictions, the role of coordination there becomes absolutely crucial. Because in the absence of coordinated efforts, and Christine got to this, you can sometimes wind up with either jurisdictions with differing approaches, differing capacities to act, actually working at odds with one another in terms of attempting to achieve policy objectives. So you need to make sure that when you're promoting variation, that you're making sure that those efforts are coordinated among all of the various actors. And when you get into the issue of competing values, that adds an entirely new dimension.
Okay.
I just wanted to, we had automatic policy adjustment. We had a few difficulties discussing this one because we couldn't think of any examples, or we'd seen it. But when I was listening to their discussion, I just realized that it made me think that if variation is a desirable direction, then it implies a need for automatic policy adjustment, because part of the environment is going to be contrasting and competing policies, right, that are going to inherently eventually come into conflict with one another, probably, or at least come into some kind of minor disagreement. And that's going to then necessarily be, I'm not trying to negate the need for a coordination role, but a conflict with another policy should then be one of the triggers for a policy adjustment of some kind, perhaps.
Yes, yes. It might be perhaps more tied to some of the formal review processes, because it might be, in that case, difficult to sort of predefine sort of what the adjustment would be, because it's a bit of a messy environment when you got these different policies and not quite sure what the sort of the cross impacts are. So,
but there's certainly some kind of
there's
review.
A trigger there that needs to be looked at. Yeah, good point. Good point.
I'm currently engaged to write a new municipal development plan and integrated community sustainability plan for the city, and I can see, in the case of all of these tools, an attempt by my organization to apply them. But we had quite a bit of discussion at this table about, and we were talking about formal policy review and continuous learning, how, although in various professional experiences, we had seen the use of policy review and continuous learning as a way to promote adaptation, that the success of that, or the outcome as far as how much adaptiveness was created by that process, really varied. And so we spent a lot of time talking about some of the predictors, noting that one of the biggest weaknesses in our collective experience in that cycle of review and continuous learning is the continuous learning and carrying forward the products of the last review. So we talked about some of the obvious ones, like the resources available to do the review, organizational will to change, and then sort of ended up talking about a lot of the things that were just brought up about a review that's the right scope and has the right people at the table at the right time.
It's a good capture on sort of the whole, I mean, the improvement being the key sort of part of that whole tool, I guess, and sort of the challenges of doing that. So it sounds like one of the key barriers, and I think I see that in most instances, is the capacity to actually undertake that function of formal review and plugging it into the actual policy improvement. And the trick being, I guess, the groups that are actually undertaking the review are somehow plugged into the entities that are then responsible for the review, so that you're not just going about a business of having an influence on policy with your information, but you in fact are the mode of information for the person that is responsible for the improvement. So that's always the trick, the capacity, but then the right people. And I think in your case, you guys are sort of plugged into the planning is quite sort of closely tied into the decision-making core, although there's political separations and stuff like that too. But so yeah, no, it's a really nice example and about all the other issues.